Hi, Danny Johnson coming from Tim's Club, where gentlemen come to have fun. Prohibition began on January 17, 1920, when the 18th Amendment went into effect. A total of 1,520 federal prohibition agents, also known as police officers, were given the task of enforcing this law. Although it was highly controversial, prohibition was widely supported by diverse groups. Progressives believed that it would improve society, as generally did women, Southerners, those living in rural areas, and African Americans. There were a few exceptions, such as women's organizations for prohibition reform, who fought against this. Will Rogers often joked about the Southern prohibitionists. The South is dry and will vote dry. That is, everybody sober enough to stagger to the polls. Supporters of the amendment soon became quite confident that it would not be repealed, to the point that one of its creators, Senator Morris Shepherd, joked that there is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail.
Thanks, Danny. In other news, the issue of prohibition became a highly controversial one among medical professionals because alcohol was widely prescribed by physicians of the era for therapeutic purposes. Congress held hearings on the medical value of beer in 1921. Subsequently, physicians across the country lobbied for the repeal of prohibition as it applied to medicinal liquors. While the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol was illegal in the U.S., Section 29 of the Volstead Act allowed the making at home of wine and cider from fruit, but not beer. Up to 200 gallons per year could be made, and some vineyards grew grapes for home use. Also, one anomaly of the act as worded was that it did not actually prohibit the consumption of alcohol. Many people actually stockpiled wines and liquors for their own use in the latter part of the 1919 before sales of alcohol became illegal the following January. Alcoholic drinks were not always illegal in all neighboring countries. Distilleries and breweries in Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean flourished as their products were either consumed by visiting Americans or smuggled in the U.S. The Detroit River, which forms part of the border with Canada, was notoriously difficult to control, and when the U.S. government complained to the British office, had refused to intervene. Winston Churchill believed that prohibition was an affront to the whole history of mankind. Chicago became a haven for prohibition dodgers during the time known as the Roaring Twenties. Many of Chicago's most notorious gangsters, including Al Capone and his enemy Bugs Moran, made millions of dollars through illegal alcohol sales. By the end of the decade, Capone controlled all 10,000 speakeasies in Chicago and ruled the bootlegging business from Canada to Florida. Numerous other crimes, including theft and murder, were directly linked to the criminal activities in Chicago and elsewhere in violation of prohibition.
Al Capone. Capone was public enemy number one. He had moved to Chicago in 1920, where he worked for Johnny Torrio, the city's leading figure in the underworld. Capone was given the task of intimidating Torrio's rivals within the city so that they would give up and hand over to Torrio their territory. Capone also had to convince speakeasy operators to buy illegal alcohol from Torrio. Capone was very good at what he did. In 1925, Torrio was nearly killed by a rival gang, and he decided to get out of the criminal world while he was still alive. Torrio handed over to Capone his business. Within 2 years, Capone was earning $60 million a year from alcohol sales alone. Other rackets earned him an extra $45 million a year. Capone managed to bribe both the police and the important politicians of Chicago. He spent $75 million in such ventures, but considered a good investment of his huge fortune. His armed thugs patrolled election booths to ensure that Capone's politicians were returned to office. The city's mayor, after 1927, was Big Bill Thompson, one of Capone's men. Thompson said, "We'll not only reopen places these people have closed, but we'll open 10,000 new ones." He was talking about speakeasies. For all his power, Capone still had enemies. From other surviving gangs in the city, he drove everywhere in an armored-plated limousine and wherever he went. So did his armed bodyguards. Violence was a daily occurrence in Chicago. 227 gangsters were killed in the space of 4 years, and on St. Valentine's Day, 1929, 7 members of the O'Banion gang were shot dead by gangsters dressed as police officers. In 1931, the law finally caught up with Capone. He was charged with tax evasion. He got 11 years in jail, and in prison his health went, and when he was released, he retired to his Florida mansion, no longer the feared man he was from 1925 to 1931.
As early as 1925, journalist H.L. Mencken believed that Prohibition was not working. As the Prohibition years continued, more of the country's populace came to see Prohibition as illustrative of class distinctions, a law unfairly biased in its administration favoring social elites. Prohibition worked best when directed at its primary target, the working class poor, he said. A rich family could have a cellar full of liquor, but if a poor family had a bottle of home brew, there would be trouble. Working class people were inflamed by the fact that their employers could dip into a cache of private stock, while they, the employees, were denied a similar indulgence. Indeed, before the date that the 18th Amendment became national law, many of the upper classes stockpiled alcohol for home consumption. They bought out the inventories of warehouses, saloons, club storerooms. They emptied out liquor retailers and wholesalers. American lawmakers themselves followed these practices at the highest levels of government. President Woodrow Wilson moved his own supply of alcoholic beverages to his Washington residence after his term of office ended. His successor, Warren G. Harding, relocated his own large supply into the White House after his inauguration. As Prohibition became increasingly unpopular, especially in the big cities, repeal was eagerly anticipated. Economic urgency played no small part in accelerating the advocacy for repeal. Prior to 1920 and the institution of the Volstead Act, approximately 14% of federal, state, and local tax revenue was derived from alcohol commerce. The government badly needed income and further felt that reinstating the manufacture and sale of alcohol would create desperately needed jobs for the unemployed. On March 22, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an amendment to the Volstead Act known as the Collin-Harrison Act, allowing the manufacture and sale of 3.2 beer, also known as 3.2% by weight, approximately 4% by volume, and light wines. The original Volstead Act had defined intoxicating beverage as one with greater than 0.5% alcohol. Upon signing the amendment, Roosevelt made his famous remark, "I think this would be a good time for a beer."
The Collin-Harrison Act became law on April 7, 1933, and on April 8, 1933, Anheuser-Busch Incorporated sent a team of Clydesdale horses to deliver a case of Budweiser to the White House. The 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933, with ratification of the 21st Amendment. Despite the efforts of Herbert J. Grant, a man who later became a prophet in the LDS Church, a Utah convention helped ratify the 21st Amendment. While Utah can be considered the deciding 36th state to ratify the amendment and make it law, the day Utah approved the amendment, both Pennsylvania and Ohio approved it as well. One of the main reasons why enforcement of Prohibition did not proceed smoothly was the inefficient means of enforcing the laws set forth by the 18th Amendment. From its very inception, the law lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the public, who had previously been drinkers and yet completely lacked law-abiding citizens. The public in some instances viewed the laws as being arbitrary and unnecessary, and therefore were willing to breach them. Consequently, law enforcement agents who had not been bribed to turn a blind eye found themselves overwhelmed by the dramatic rise in the illegal distribution of alcohol on such a wide scale due to the Volstead Act. The scale of the task was not anticipated, and consequently the necessary resources to pursue it were not allocated. Additionally, enforcement of the 18th Act's centralized authority and many attempts to impose prohibitionist laws were deterred due to the lack of transparency between federal and state authorities. Furthermore, the reality of American geography contributes significantly to the difficulties in enforcing prohibition. The terrain of valleys, mountains, lakes, and swamps, as well as the extensive seaways, ports, and massive borders running along Canada and Mexico made it exceedingly difficult for prohibition agents to stop bootleggers, given their lack of resources. Ultimately, it was recognized with its repeal that the means by which the law was to be enforced was not pragmatic, and that in many cases the legislature did not match the general public opinion.
Prohibition was a major blow for the alcohol industry, and the repeal was therefore a step toward the amelioration of one sector of the economy. A perfect example for this is the case of St. Louis. The city had been one of the most important alcohol producers before Prohibition started and was ready to take back its position as soon as possible. Its major brewery had 50,000 barrels of beer ready to be sent since March 22nd. It was the first alcohol producer to refill the market, but others followed. This slowly allowed stores to obtain alcohol after, of course, having obtained a license. The restart of beer production allowed thousands of workers to find jobs again. Prohibition created a black market that competed with the formal economy, which already was under pressure. Roosevelt was elected based on the New Deal, which promised improvement to the economy that was only possible if the formal economy competed successfully against various economic forces, including the effects of Prohibition's black market. This influenced his support for ratifying the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment that had established Prohibition.
Before Prohibition, a man who drinks alone would only drink in a place like this.
But after Prohibition, a dump like this would be turned to a party house.
Yo, bartender, I get 3 drinks for my boys.
Yeah, coming right up. Three strong ones.
This is for all the haters.
Yeah. Chug, chug, chug.
Man, what's going on down there?
Get out! The police are here!
Wop bobble wop blah bam boom tutti frutti, oh Rudy, 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 wop bobble wop.